an original MCM production.
It's a great pleasure to welcome in our midst today Tom Weiss. Tom is a professor of political science at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, where he also headed the Ralph Bunche Institute for 13 years. He's also a research professor at the School for Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. After his studies at Harvard, Princeton, and in Geneva, Tom joined the United Nations, where he held several professional positions over a period of 10 years, before he left to start playing key roles at the intersection of academia and the United Nations. And his career is so rich that I could keep going until 1:15 at least, but I will compress it into this. There are very, very few people in the world who have been as prolific and as insightful as Tom has been when it comes to the questions of the United Nations, global governance, humanitarianism, human rights, and this is very important too, the power of ideas in shaping world order. And among the latter is the responsibility to protect, which is a new norm in relationship to the responsibility to protect. Tom played a key role in its genesis and continues to play a key role in its promotion. I said he's very prolific, 50 books, big deal, Tom. 225 articles and book chapters, But in any case, I highly recommend reading his publications, the latest of which is this one here, which talks about the war origins of the United Nations and uses a poster that you find in the northeastern corner on this level of the War Memorial. Also, you can get up, Tom, I'm done. Also recommended is a radio interview he gave this morning to Lake Effect, which will be aired most likely on Friday. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Tom.
Well, thanks, Wolf, for inviting me to this side of the lake. I spent my summers on the other side. It looks actually remarkably similar, looking in both directions. It's unusual for a Rotary Club to actually be interested in the United Nations, so I'm delighted that there's this fund that got me here and delighted to speak. Dan asked me before why out of all the things to be interested in graduate school, I got interested in the United Nations. And I did tell him a story about an internship I had, which is actually part of the truth. The other day I decided that in looking back and preparing a course, that I actually was conceived during the San Francisco conference and was born as the General Assembly was opening in London. So I think it was in mother's milk. But I hope, nonetheless, to indicate a few critical things we can say about this. The title today, 1945's Lesson, and the cover that Wolf presented. For me, I've become an amateur historian as opposed to just a political scientist, and I'm intrigued by the origins of institutions and what happens to them. So the lesson today is called 1945's Lesson, Global Governance Ain't Good Enough. While my high school English teacher wouldn't like that particular billing, what I want to look at is why, at the present moment, not just in my field, but in a whole series of others, people are so infatuated with, obsessed with, actually, the private sector. And the private sector means civil society, means the Rotarians, it means corporations, it means the media. They're not so interested in intergovernmental organizations, to put it kindly. So I want to go back to that period because the period from 1942 to 1945, most people don't remember and that poster on the front of the book, that the United Nations actually began on the 1st of January 1942. There was a declaration by United Nations that had 44 signatories. This was the alliance to defeat fascism, but it was much more, actually. It was a commitment to international cooperation, which is in very short supply these days and doesn't have the same reputation. So I think many people look upon the United Nations as a kind of a liberal toy to be tossed aside when the going gets tough, whereas at that point, not just in Roosevelt's mind, not just in Churchill's mind, but in the leaders and the populations of some 44 countries that were part of the United Nations alliance. So it was I'm going to use a big word here. It was a vision of sorts. It was idealism. It was a commitment to international cooperation as the best way to get the job done. And I think most people forget that in 1942, this was not a slam dunk. The outcome of the war was not actually a foregone conclusion. And so I want to go back to that period because here we are. Last year we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II. And the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. And now we're approaching the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. So for me, it's a very good moment to take stock because essentially wars lead to big thinking, unusual thinking, outside of the box, to use a term that we now use frequently but wasn't used then. The paradox, of course, is that at present, you can all list your favorite problems that go beyond the capacity of this country or any other country to solve. Proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, climate change, Ebola, we can go on and on. And there was a different approach during 42 to 45. In fact, in some ways, I see this as almost a summit or a pinnacle of international cooperation. This, of course, evaporated almost instantly with the Cold War, but it didn't have to evaporate instantly. So my preoccupation with this period is that we seem to have a kind of a reverse Alzheimer's disease, that this longer-term memory gets buried, and we're focused on the failures and the clumsiness in current international relations, rather than what I say is actually the summit of international cooperation. The proposition here is actually straightforward. When governments decide to use these institutions, they work. That isn't all that frequent. So we can hold up Syria, if we want to talk about that during questions, as this hopeless UN Security Council. Yeah, there's a pretty good explanation for that because the members get exactly the United Nations they deserve and vote for. When those same members decided that it was time to eliminate chemical weapons, the same people that have brought you inaction and 250,000 deaths, 12 million displaced people, also decided that it was time to get rid of chemical weapons. And there was one institution that could do that, the UN in collaboration with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So this is a sort of a long story that leads to really a conclusion that our infatuation with global governance, which is sort of formal and informal rules, institutions, operations. So within a country, we can criticize local, state, and federal governments, but the Rotary Club or Oxfam or other kinds of community organizations are complements to a working central authority. At the planet, we only have this soft stuff. So that rather than we have sort of, here we have governance plus government. At the global level, we have governance minus government. So there is no overarching authority to address the kinds of problems that I think need to be addressed. And so, ironically, I was the editor of a journal called Global Governance. I've written a book on that. But it was an important step forward to try to understand the complexity of international relations, the current international system and world order. But the pendulum has swung way out of direction so that intergovernmental organizations, in particular those of the UN and the UN system, are kind of afterthought, if a thought at all. And frankly, the kinds of issues that preoccupy me, that Kofi Annan once said, we have problems without passports. No state is going to address them. And without some kind of central structure to address some of these problems, we're frankly not going to address them. So for me, the puzzle, Wolf mentioned that I'm sometimes at the University of London. Around Russell Square, you have a wonderful set of 18th and 19th century buildings, and you have some god-awful structures in between, which of course were built after the Blitz. For me, the puzzle is during this period, when bombs are dropping, in London, are meeting a whole series of people thinking about the future. And the solution, actually, was not going back to 1914 minus, to the world of 1913. Everyone agreed that the League of Nations was a colossal flop. The failure led to World War II. But the solution was not to sort of do nationalism on steroids, to go back, as I say, to the law of the jungle and unbridled nationalism and the rule of the jungle. We had seen what that was in Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. The idea was to take the elements of that worked, refugees, work on economic and social development, and international civil service to address issues and build on that. So this is the puzzle that I've been dealing with. And it seems to me that going back to this period, as I say, I've become a kind of back-of-the-envelope economist. I've looked into these records. So we have Roosevelt kicking off the conversation. We mean business in this war in a political and humanitarian sense, just as surely as we mean business in a military sense. This was Roosevelt addressing the first meeting of the first operational agency of the UN, the UNRWA, the Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, that committed 1% of GDP to social work, the kind of thing we no longer do. And this 1%, the United States paid 3/4 of the budget at that time. There was no question asked. Now, a goal such as 0.7% of our own GDP devoted to development assistance is beyond the pale. It's more like 0.1%. So I think we have to contextualize the kinds of measures that were once considered central and that are now considered totally beyond the pale. And UNRWA was not the only operation. If you go back and look at the records, most people have heard about Bretton Woods and the bank and the fund, but there were ministers of education who got together to eventually put together UNESCO. It wasn't, as I say, national education that was going to be the solution of our problems, but a different kind of education. Decolonization was on the table. War crimes, 36,000 people were under indictment by the UN War Crimes Commission. So the story is one of intense international cooperation. And so when people got together in San Francisco, and we have to remember this is before the end of the war, this is April to June of 1945, This was not a standalone undertaking. It was, as I say, a commitment. I would almost argue that this sort of idealism in some way is the basic bottom line that saved this coalition. So in going back, multilateral collaboration is not, as I say, an appendage. It's not peripheral. It was central to winning the war. And I would argue now that it's multilateralism and the rule of law that will actually save the planet, whatever the issue of most concern to you. So, as I say, the League of Nations was a spent force. We built on it. The general wreckage of the League was put together. There were study groups, one organized in the United States, the State Department. There were several in Europe. And the idea was to go beyond the League and establish an institution that could keep the peace and guarantee prosperity after the war. Well, we fast forward today. This is hardly, people think I've been inhaling as well as smoking to come forward with such a proposition. But it does seem to me that we need to go back to those days. We need to build on those lessons. And that as we move ahead, unless we do, it's going to be fairly ironic that this experiment, which began for the second war in the 20th century to end all wars, we need to go back to those origins. And I can talk about kinds of concrete advances. Earlier we heard about polio, but I mean, if you want to look at concrete successes, you could look at smallpox during the 50s and 60s. If you wanted to look at big ideas, many of the things that we consider really important, women's rights, human rights in general, the environment, all of these, there's been an important value added by the World Institution. And so I guess I'm going to just conclude because we need at least 15 minutes for questions. I came away from this research project with two questions. And the first is, must the next generation of international organizations, if the first was the League, the second was the UN, what will create, what are the drivers of change? Unfortunately, history here suggests that wars are, in fact, what trigger people to think differently. I'm hoping that that's not the answer to this question, that we can actually occasionally learn lessons from the past. But tragedies really are the currency for institutional change. And we've seen that on numerous occasions. So, my colleagues, I think we're spending too much scholarly attention trying to understand all these soft patterns of change, but it's not going to be human rights activists and Amnesty, and it's not going to be the World Wildlife Fund that's going to stop human rights abuse, mass atrocities, and climate change. It's really going to be governments, this one and 192 other ones, working through structures that go somewhat beyond the capacity of individual states, or we will not have much to pass on to my new granddaughter, who I'm seeing in about an hour, that we're not going to take the maximum benefit of globalization. And so we need to go back to that period and rediscover, I would say, the sort of intensity of the idealism that characterized that moment and what happened to have been probably the most important military victory. But it wasn't just Allied, it wasn't just an Anglo-American military victory. It really was a victory for an idea related to how do you organize the planet. So why don't I just stop there? That's my 15 minutes of fame, and I'd like to entertain questions from all of you. So. Somebody in the middle, sir.
Does international cooperation depend upon people basically agreeing on the way the world should be? That seems to be the big breakdown.
Does cooperation, well, there should be some values. One of those values would be that you don't trample on a neighbor. Another would be that you respect the rights of your population. But there also is an operating procedure that in fact involves consultation of one sort or another. And we know that big countries, major powers, always have more to say than smaller ones. That's not new. That the story I'm telling, obviously, London and Washington were the key players in that 42 to 45 period. But there were lots of other really important activities going on, including what Imperial India was doing, what China was doing, what all of Latin America was doing. So, as I say, the story is much more complicated than London and Washington getting together. There was a commitment to involving people in a consultative process, and it seems to me that that is essential for any sort of cooperation. But beyond that is, as you say, a kind of an agreement on the nature of the planet on which you want to live. So, I guess over the years, I'm not trying to construct an ideal home, but I think Wolf mentioned the responsibility to protect, a sort of a commitment that if there is a state that is unable or unwilling to protect its own population, there is a responsibility of the international community of states to come to the rescue and protect them. That is not a very high bar. I mean, we're not talking about garden variety of human rights. We're talking about mass atrocities. We're talking about mass ethnic cleansing. And so I don't think I've constructed a castle here, but I do think that there are certain values like that one, that we should not live on a planet in which mass murder is a policy option. It seems to me that that's the kind of basic value that should pull countries together as opposed to pulling them apart. Sir?
If the recent deal with Iran had been presented to the UN, do you think it would have passed?
Well, it has, actually. The Security Council, including the United States, endorsed it 15-0. So could that deal have been struck within the confines of the United Nations? The UN sanctions were an important part of the package that was used to lure Iran closer to a negotiating table. The International Atomic Energy Agency is going to be an important part of the verification process. So it seems to me that the negotiations proceeded more quickly, even though it took 10 years, outside of the UN, but with the UN involved both in terms of the decision to have multilateral sanctions as opposed to just individual country sanctions. And it will be part of the verification process as we go along. I think that one tends to forget, for example, that in Iraq, while Washington was claiming that there were weapons of mass destruction, if you look at the records from the inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency, they basically said there was no evidence whatsoever. They turned out, in fact, to be correct. Why, the CIA and gave Colin Powell that information to argue is still a big mystery. But I certainly am not arguing that there aren't problems. And if I've written a book called What's Wrong with the UN and How to Fix It, comes with a hammer and saw. But there are lots and lots of problems. And I've spent most of my career trying to figure out how to make this institution or members of this institution work better than in the past. And I still think that there are lots of steps that could be taken to make it work better. There's more waste than there should be. There's more tripping over one another than there should be. But there's still a lot more that could be done with this. I see, are you going to come up and bang my head or the bell? Yes. Do we have time for one more or not? One quick question, sorry. I'm just going to, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
An MCM production.